Thanks so much for coming.
Are we live? Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Rabbinic Chavrusa in memory of Rabbi Lord Sachs. We do this Rabbinic Chavrusa every month with a different guest rabbi from Anglo Jewry. And I want to check with you. Tonight we have Rabbi Dr Zarum, and it's a real privilege. And thank you to all of you who have come out to Hampstead Garden Suburb this evening. And thank you to those of you who are joining us virtually. It's wonderful to have everybody here, and very timely that we have Rabbi Dr Zarum, who is Dean of London School of Jewish Studies, and I think in that respect, in many ways, a successor to Rabbi Lord Sachs. And,
on a very different level.
well, it's you are one of the great leaders and Jewish intellectuals of Anglo Jewry today, and yes, while it may be true that Rabbi Lord Sachs was head and shoulders above probably an entire generation, we are honored to have you, Rabbi Dr Zarum, as the leader of our Anglo-Jewish academic religious institution. And it's fabulous to have you here this evening. And we're going to talk about the book, The Great Partnership, which is science, religion, and the search for meaning. And I have to say, in some ways, you've said that you're not quite of the caliber of Rabbi Lord Sachs, but you are a scientist. Rabbi Lord Sachs was a rabbi, a philosopher, and you have a PhD in physics. And so, I think it's it'll be a lot of fun this evening as we discuss the Great Partnership. So
it's very nice to see that one. That you probably bought in Canada, right?
Yeah, I bought this. Yeah, well, yeah.
Canadian edition, you haven't seen it.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's the same book, hopefully. I think maybe we might have to spell some of the things a little differently. But yeah, so let's begin with this. Rabbi Zarum.
Yes.
Tell us a little about your relationship with Rabbi Sachs and the impact he had on your life.
There's two kinds of people, kids who grew up. There's those who grew up after Harry Potter, and there's those who grew up during Harry Potter. And if you were at the age, as each book came out, it was a whole different ballgame. People lined around the streets to do this and grew up with the novels. I grew up with Rabbi Sachs's writings. I was very lucky, just timing-wise. I think the first time I heard him speak was in 1985, I think. He was giving the annual Chief Rabbi Jakovovitz lecture. So at this point, he was the principal, just becoming the principal of Jews College. And it was an annual lecture. My father took me along. I was 17 years old and wanted to hear an intellectual. And this was the first kind of really eloquent, clear explainer of Jewish ideas and thought that really blew my mind. I still remember what he said. It was about community. And he said, the largest size of a shul should be the amount of people that the rabbi can get to know well.
Wow.
And it's just so obvious. But, it's those kind of clear thinking and so on. And then, when his first book came out, my mother bought it for me for my birthday. And then every year since. So I read them as he wrote them. I went to many of the book launches. For this one, he actually sent me in advance to read through it because of my scientific background to see what I thought about it.
So essentially you're saying, let me just stop you. So had you grown up, a few years later, you might have ended up as the Dean of Hogswart.
Yeah, but it's different when you... So I watched his thought grow and develop, and I really enjoyed that. So for me, there was always, what's the next book he's going to write? What's his new thinking? Where's he going with this? And it became an important part of my life.
Wow.
And I was very privileged to get to know him. When I was 16, 17, I couldn't always get to him. 18, actually, I couldn't get to him. But because he was the chief... In 91, he became the chief rabbi. So there was one time a year that I could get him to read whatever I wanted. When was that? Yom Ha'atzmaut. Because he would go, I won't say where it was before the Finchley days, and there was a very big, long choir, not his choir, and he got a bit bored during the davening. So before, I would arrive early with B'nai Akiva, and I would leave what I was reading, the article or things I was interested in, on his stender, right? Then he would arrive, sit there, go, right? And then start reading it. And that way, a little message from me at the end.
Wow.
So that's how you get to your heroes. You find a way to kind of cheat and do that. And then I was privileged, because I became the dean of the college, to have a professional relationship with him. And we met every 6 weeks for a long time, for 10 years.
Well, it really is.
Talk about leadership. So it's a real honor.
Well, it's an honor to have you here, and somebody that was so close to Rabbi Sachs. And you mentioned not his choir. As the way the Almighty works in mysterious ways, we actually have his choir here this evening. I'm not sure if they'll do a number for us. The Shabbaton choir is out the back practicing for Slichos night. So if we hear some music in the background, I was going to say it's not the angels singing. It is the angels singing, but it's different angels that are singing. But it's Rabbi Sachs's angels that endure the Shabbaton choir is out practicing. So fantastic. Wow, somebody who, I think this must be the Rabbinic Chavrusa with the rabbi who was really closest with Rabbi Sachs. And
he was his own person, he had private, he had his own family, spent time with his family. But I learned his Torah from his books, but I learned his leadership from seeing how he acted in the world.
That's amazing.
And how he directed and educated me to be a decent, human being and a responsible leader, which is always very difficult. And I learned from him, and it was,
Excellent. Well, thank you. So this evening we're going to be doing the Great Partnership.
Yes.
Tell us, apart from the obvious, what this book means to you.
Well, this was a book that was a long time coming, and he actually didn't want to write it, actually. Because what was going on, this is like the early 2000s, is the rise of what we call the new atheists. Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, a poster on the side of a bus, God probably doesn't exist, so be happy and get on with your life. And this whole kind of rejection thing that was going on. And there was and religious people were feeling under attack. And so they wanted someone to respond to it. And even the Christian leaders thought, Rabbi Sachs would be great to do this. And Stuart Rodin, who was on the office of the Chief Rabbi's committee, studied as well, encouraged Rabbi Sachs. He says that at the beginning of the book, to write this book, and said, you need a Jewish response. But all the other books I read every time, were religion and science. Because I studied physics, undergraduate and PhD, I always bought the Judaism, religion and science books, and I didn't like most of them. Obviously, except for my cousins, Not on Slifkin, available in all good bookstores, very good. But I didn't like them because they didn't do it very well. Otherwise, Sachs is not a scientist. So you've got a non-scientist writing a book about religion and science. And basically what he wanted to do is move the agenda on. Instead of being the great religion and science debate, A versus B, he said it's a great partnership. It's not a great debate, it's a great partnership. And the reason you think it's a debate is because you've misunderstood what science and religion are and what they're for. So the book was all about, when he spoke to the BBC, because he met Richard Dawkins in a conversation, the whole idea was to move the conversation forward from debate to the value of both. And he writes very clearly that he values both, which was quite radical in a way for a religious leader to talk in that way.
Yeah, and I think really the way you describe it, in many ways, it was probably one of the pivotal moments that he made his mark as the public religious intellectual who impacted, prime ministers and Prince Charles. And
he did a radio show about it. He did a 2-hour conversation with Richard Dawkins, and they got on very well. Richard really liked him. It was a really interesting conversation they did. At one point, Richard said, I'm an atheist, and Rabbi Sachs said, you're a Christian atheist. He goes, what do you mean? He goes, the God you don't believe in is a Christian God. He says, I'm not so partial to him myself. So it had a very interesting conversation. But there were loggerheads offered because they didn't understand where Sachs was coming from. But it was a very important book to write. And it's not a Jewish book in that he doesn't give Jewish arguments. He says near the beginning, I'm writing this to the general public. It's an argument about religion. If you're interested in the Jewish sources, look at the end. And that's where he quotes all the classic books, including my cousin Slifkin's books, available at all the bookstores, as I mentioned before. The Challenge of Creation, which Nosson is, and Rabbi Sachs met Nosson a few times as well. They talked about it. But this is not about religion and science, it's about the philosophy of religion and science.
Just to throw in a bit of an anecdote, I'm just putting the pieces of the puzzle together this evening. Now, obviously, I know, Rabbi Zarum, you have a Yemenite background. Rabbi Slifkin doesn't. Not the same side of the family?
Natan's mother and my mother are sisters.
But is that the Yemenite side?
So my father's Yemenite.
Right, because...
So I'm half Welsh, half Yemenite.
So
the Welsh Cohens, people know, who are Levian. It's a whole big thing, yeah. Connects to that, go on.
Right, as in Shimon in our shul.
Yes.
Excellent. So December 2019, Rabbi Slifkin was out here. He stayed in our house. And he had a parlor meeting, I'm not sure if you had anything to do with it, in Hendon somewhere, where he served grasshoppers.
That's right.
Now, I know that the Yemenite tradition, I know we'll get to Rabbi Sachs just a moment, just a bit of an anecdote, is the tradition of the grasshopper locust that is kosher. And he actually prepared them in our freezer.
Yes, that's right.
But now I know that there is a connection and that it's not just...
No, he gave one to us to eat, and I gave it to my daughter. And she was like 8, and she was very upset, and buried it in the garden back of Independence, and named it Larry the Locust and buried it. So I said, you can eat it. She goes, I'm going to bury it. There you go.
All right, but back to Rabbi Sachs. So the format this evening, what we'll do is we'll each take a chapter, talk about the chapter, and then discuss it between the two of us. So I'll begin with chapter 1 and a little bit of chapter 2. Essentially, Rabbi Sachs lays out in this chapter the thesis of his book that science and religion are not two contradictory ideas. Science explains what, and religion explains why. There's nothing in science to suggest that the universe is bereft of meaning. That's not what science is about. Science is explaining how it works, but not any meaning behind it. The meaning of the system, says Rabbi Sachs, always lies outside of the system. So it's not within the universe that you can find the meaning of the universe. You have to search beyond the universe in order to understand the meaning of the universe. Now, he talks about the gods of yesteryear, the gods of polytheism. And he says the problem, and this really is part of what you'd mentioned, Rabbi Zarum, the notion of the Christian God versus the Jewish God, and the Christian God being rooted in some of the Greek philosophy. Polytheistic gods were part and parcel of the universe. There was the god of rain and the god of the sea. All of those gods were part of creation, part of the universe, not outside the universe. The introduction of monotheism wasn't a quantitative difference between many gods versus one God. It was a qualitative difference between polytheism, which is gods within this universe, versus monotheism, a God that's outside the universe, giving meaning from beyond. Being part of this universe, polytheists can believe in gods that are immortal, but ultimately they're still here as part of the system. Now, Rabbi Sachs says that you can't prove that life is meaningful and God exists. But you also can't prove a lot of things in this world. You can't prove that love is better than hate. You can't prove that altruism is better than being selfish. But just because you can't prove them doesn't mean that you don't get to choose which path is the right path, which is the desirable path. We can choose love over hate. There's nothing that says we should that dictates to us one over the other. It's our choice. Similarly, just because there's no way of proving that there is meaning beyond this universe, that there is one God, it's a choice. Either there is or there isn't. Those are two paths that one is obligated to make a choice between one or the other. It's not simply a matter of choosing is wrong. We're always making choices, and it's up to us to choose between these two paths. Now, to believe on the basis of science that life has no meaning, says Rabbi Sachs, confuses two disciplines, explanation and interpretation. He then gets into chapter 2, and I'll just touch on this because I know we're not covering it, but just his, really it's a parable, because we know that the notions of right brain versus left brain are not entirely, at least in our 21st century understanding, really scientific. But our analogies of right brain being something that is creative and ideas-based versus the left brain being very scientific, mathematical, he compares the two philosophies, traditions of Greece versus the Hebrew tradition and says they're two different languages that we're talking. He even talks about writing from right to left versus left to right and the way that they develop based on different systems. He says, look into the Torah. The Torah is not written as a code, it's written as a narrative, because that's the way the religion, that's the way God speaks in narrative in order to be able to impress upon us something more than just the facts on the way that they appear, black and white. And that's the meaning that we are trying to access with something beyond the universe itself.
Absolutely, but it's interesting because Greek thought, even though it became philosophical, systematic thought, it did begin in mythology and stories. But by the time Christianity responds to it, it's already a scientific system. And because, as you say, Christianity, it works in Greek and then in Latin, it takes subconsciously on, he says, the philosophical approach of the Greeks of physical reality, and therefore the need to see God in nature. So the people who reject the new atheists, who are kind of set up as the creationists, the Christian creationists in America, are always looking to see God in nature, right? So it's something that would prove that. So whether the eye, you could prove, couldn't have been made by a human being, had to be put there, the blind watchmaker, that whole issue is a Christian issue.
Right.
And Jews never had that, he said. That's the mistake. So Jews watch this debate about the Christians proving, I'm going to show you some irreducible biological aspect of nature that couldn't have happened through randomness, therefore there has to be a God, which hasn't been proved, versus the atheists who are going, they're ridiculous. The Jews are going, but why would you expect to see God in nature at all?
Right.
So he's saying the whole debate is a mistake. And he argues the Christian view comes from Greek thinking. No one else does that. It is completely original to that approach. And it's a brilliant philosophical response to a scientific debate.
Absolutely. I think what's important, though, and he leaves this to the last chapter, which we won't get to in chapter 14. And we'll get to, okay, is that he does, though, leave options. Because I think that people do think differently. Look, things like Torah codes are not going to cut it for a lot of people, but for some people it will. And he does give various proofs of religion because it will make sense, it will be the driving force for certain people. For other people, I think he makes it very clear that from his perspective, the notion, like you say, of proving anything in that scientific manner is futile, because you can't win.
He's following and finally properly reading Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for Collection of the Rambam. And Rambam every so often says, it's really this, but if you want to believe, he's talking about Mount Sinai, about things, about positions, and he goes, but if you want to believe it literally like this, it doesn't hurt. He literally says that.
Right.
It's okay to think in that way.
Right.
Certain things he doesn't want. He's very against idolatry, misunderstandings of those issues. But he doesn't mind. And Rabbi Sachs follows often the Rambam to the letter. People don't realise.
Interesting.
So in public TV, he would say things, so that's quite shocking. And he's literally quoting the Rambam.
Amazing.
People haven't read it.
Right.
So he doesn't mind on that level, absolutely. But the idea of proof is scientific. And scientific is physics, which is measurement. And measurement is physical reality. And if you could measure God, that would be idolatry, because God isn't physical. So for Rabbi Sachs, the whole idea of measuring God is anti-religious. So it's not something you could even possibly prove.
And I think when you talk about the Rambam, too many people think of the Rambam in terms of his Mishnah Torah. And his Mishnah Torah was really an anomaly as far as Rabbi Sachs's description of the way Judaism works. The Rambam wanted to take the corpus of the Talmud and summarize it black and white. What do you do? What are the steps? Because the Gemara is just too much going on. But really, Rabbi Sachs is saying that was how it was meant to work. All of the Agadah, the stories, the discussions, everything's thrown in together that seems to us like there's no rhyme or reason. That, Rabbi Sachs would say, is actually the formula that we're looking for, the non-formula of Judaism.
Yeah, absolutely. But the Mishnah is a very practical book that you need. We're back in Yemenite territory.
Yes.
But about how central the Mishnah Torah was. There's actually something one of my Rabbanim taught about the Mishnah Torah, which you'll like very much, about so I'm doing this especially for you. I'll do it politely, but you'll really like this, I think. At the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, and this is about Rabbi Sachs ultimately, the Rambam talks about big issues, the nature of reality, what are angels, what is God, this kind of stuff, and what's called the work of the chariot and everything. And he says there's two levels of Torah. there's what we call about the discussions of Abaye and Rav, the halachic debates, and those he calls are davar katan. But then he says the big issues of the nature of reality, what is philosophy, what is God, why are we here, is a davar gadol. Remember that, right? And he says, and I've given a little bit about davar gadol for the first 4 chapters, and now we're going to get into davar katan. So nowadays, when we talk about someone being a gadol, the gedolim, we're talking about rabbis who are experts on Jewish law. So technically, according to the Rambam, they are katanim, because they're subject to these issues. A real gadol is someone, and the Rambam says, by the way, you can't get to gadol before you get to katan. You have to do all the halacha before you get to philosophy. But a real gadol, a great sage, is someone who has studied all Jewish law, become a rabbi, and then got into philosophy. Rabbi Sachs.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in that sense, he's a true rabbi, a true gadol. I don't want to denigrate anybody.
True.
In terms of the Rambam's definition of what the exact use of the word katan and gadol.
That's
what a gadol
that's
is.
excellent, and that's your original, no doubt.
No, it's not my rough taught me that, another Rav. But we talked about Rabbi Sachs fills that gap. He said to me, I think Rabbi Sachs is a true gadol because of the way the Rambam describes it.
And I think practically, I didn't think there was anybody that had as much impact on society at large in our generation as Rabbi Sachs.
But I'll tell you why he didn't want to write this book as well. He didn't like being defensive. He liked going into issues, right? In fact, he told me never to talk about modern orthodoxy, Rafi, at the college. He used to say this, he said, don't give lectures on what is modern orthodoxy, it just ends up with debate and fight. So I said, what do I do? So he smiled and he said, show them how we learn. Show them how we learn, which is clearly showing what his approach was, which is show by the way you study Tanakh, by the way you study Talmud, by the way you do Jewish history, what it means to integrate those two worlds.
Wow, that's excellent.
He really believed. But so for this book, his other books are using Torah to explain something. So in The Politics of Hope, he uses Torah to explain about society. Right? In each book, he's using his Torah on future tense to the response of Israel. In this book, it's not Torah to explain something else. It's Torah to solve the problem. In this book, the problem is Torah. The problem is religion. And this book and the one afterwards, Not in God's Name, are both defences of Torah. Not in God's name in terms of fundamentalism, and this in terms of religion and science. So it's not his style to do it, but no one else could. We all said, you have to write this. So he did, and then obviously he did it in his way.
One almost thinks of, the likes of certainly the Rambam and his Moreh Nevuchim that wasn't apologetic. Maybe, again, probably not his first choice, or the Ramban and the Disputation. Again, not his major magnum opus. But let's move on to chapter 4, shall we?
Yeah, so I love chapter 4, because chapter 4 is his personal chapter. In other words, he talks about his story of when he was in university. And I really like this because a lot of people who are questioning faith are often students and are thinking about fighting. So chapter 4 is literally called Finding God. And he tells his story of being in, just finding my pages here, of being in university himself. And what's brilliant is, and this is really shocking, so I've got to read it out to you, is it over here? Yes. So he begins by being taught, because he studied philosophy at Oxford and Cambridge, he was taught the proofs of God, and as a kind of child's play, the disproofs, and why they don't work. And he really enjoyed that, and he writes, so my induction into godless philosophy did wonders for my faith. It cleared the garden of religion from the covering of weeds that was the disfiguring the lawn and hiding the flowers. And for him, disfiguring the lawn is the childish proofs for God. And this is, it's so radical when you think what he's saying here. He says, that's not what religion is, it's a complete misunderstanding, and it really helped him to think in that way. He said, nor did I expect otherwise. If God created the world, then his existence must be compatible with the world. If he created human intelligence, his existence must not be an insult to the intelligence. So all the proofs are insults to the intelligence. They don't work. He pulls holes in them in terms of human miracles, all the different ones. And so he says, and if the greatest gift he gave humanity was freedom, then religion could not establish itself by coercion. So it can't be that a scientific proof could be coercion. So, he just begins by immediately wiping the floor with this, I'm not going to look in that kind of way. And then he tells his story, which is quite famous, about when he was looking for God and studying university, and then going to America, the famous story of meeting Rav Soloveitchik and the Rebbe, which is very interesting. And then, but again from a different angle, and then he talks about how he looks for God. And I think this is important over here as well. If I can read it out to you, because he says it better than I could. Yes. And look, I'm not going to tell you exactly what's in the chapter, because I want you to read it. Because he basically argues with his professor, Bernard Lewis, of his approach to thinking and philosophy. And it's
Bernard Williams.
Bernard Williams, sorry, Bernard Lewis is the Muslim expert, right, Islam expert. And it's interesting to see how he rejects it. I mean, at one point, Professor Williams says to him, Sachs, how can you be religious after he's come back? How can you be religious and yet understand philosophy? So he says, well, Professor, think of me as a lapsed skeptic, which I love, by the way, lapsed skeptic. So it's like a skeptic who lapses into faith. He's very good, Sachs, very good. That was an answer he could cope with. So he dealt with it. But then Sachs writes, and it's very beautiful. He says, I've sought God in the meanings that have inspired people to live in such a way that their lives seem to point to something larger than themselves. What Matthew Arnold called the power not ourselves that makes for righteousness. And what the rabbis meant when they said the divine presence spoken through them. He basically says it's not a philosophical issue, it's about understanding the nature of reality, and he's seen it more than anywhere else in the face of people. We at the college are doing a series of Talmudim of Rabbi Sachs from all over the world, different aspects of philosophy. And Johnny Cohen's, Rabbi Johnny Cohen's of Jerusalem was very interesting. He talks about how much Rabbi Sachs learnt about faith through talking to people and how he saw it through there. And he begins talking about it in this book over here. But then he talks about the classic issue of faith being not about proof, but about uncertainty. Not about doubt, slightly different, but uncertainty. He says, faith is not certainty. It's the courage to live with uncertainty. Faith is never easy. The greatest heroes of the moral life, like the greatest artists and scientists and thinkers, like anyone who has undertaken to live a life of high ideals, knows failure after failure, disappointment after disappointment. I always like to quote Winston Churchill on that. You know what he said about leadership? He said, leadership is moving from one failure to the next without any loss of enthusiasm. Which is just brilliant. Anyway, what made them great is that they refused to despair, like Jacob wrestling with the angel and so on. So he says that faith is not about certainty and proof, it's about struggling with the issues. My understanding of the difference of religion and science, which Sachs talks about, comes from a thinker called Karen Armstrong, who was originally a nun for 20 years. I don't know if you've read any of her works, and then left that and became a great writer about philosophy and religion and science. And she wrote a book at the same time as Rabbi Sachs called The Case for God. And that's why those two books came out at the same time. She actually spoke in this room about 15 years ago when the rabbi organised with LSJS a series about God. And we brought her in, right? She is not a huge fan of Israel and had been a nun for 20 years. And this room was packed with 400 people, and they came out, and some very religious people. One woman came up to me, was brought up very religious, and she said, I learned more about God from that woman in that last hour than my entire Jewish childhood.
Wow.
She spoke it's a very important book to read, The Case for God. And it came out the same time as Rabbi Sachs. And she explains, similar to Rabbi Sachs, the ancients never confused mythos and logos. They never confused logic and belief in the gods. And she gives a really good example of going back 2,000 or 3,000 years when they're hunting in an African tribe, hunting for an animal. And when they're hunting the day for the animal, they have to be very careful. The spear has to be exactly sharp. They have to go in formation, they have to chuck the spear, kill the animal, they have to coordinate. They have to be very scientifically accurate about what they're doing, and very rational and logical. And then they kill the animal at night, and they take its heart, and they will burn it and offer sacrifice to the gods, and then at night dance around in circles, thanking their gods for the capture. No contradiction between the accurate functions of the day, right, the logos, and the mythology at night. They weren't confused between the two things. They understood. One had a spiritual meaning, and one was a very practical thing. And she said we've lost that confusion. And by Sachs as well naturally sees the difference between these two worlds. But the reason I like this chapter is he tells his own story of realising the difference between religion and science. And that's why that chapter is so important for the first third of the book.
Right. Very powerful. I mean, I haven't read Karen Armstrong. I will admit, and at risk, I know we're being recorded here, I will admit to have learned a thing or two about God from C.S. Lewis
Oh, good, yeah.
and Dinesh D'Souza.
Right.
And I'm not talking about the Narnia series either. But he did write other pieces.
It's very Jewish, the Narnia series.
I know you're into that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, what's the opening? What's the name of the lion?
Remind us.
Aslan, which is Atzlan, which is lazy, right? Lazy like a lion. And Tanakh talks about it. So they're very conscious of Hebrew, all these guys. They learn their Hebrew.
Well, C.S. Lewis, I mean, he was a theologian, so...
Exactly, and Tolkien, all of them got together, and they knew this kind of stuff.
Right.
But no, C.S. Lewis was great.
Right.
I read the Screwtape Letters and the Four Loves in Yeshiva. They gave it to me.
Oh, really?
That stuff. But Rabbi Sachs would want us to read all the different books on the subject. Why would you think we could only find understandings of God within Jewish sources?
Absolutely.
Our understandings are there, but if God is part of reality, we'd see it in all different contexts.
I mean, the fact is he's quoting Aristotle. And so, you mentioned something about his journey to America. And like you say, it's a famous story, and he mentions it in a number of his books, and something that each time he tells a story, I kind of gloss over because, okay, that's his personal journey. But it's clearly something that you've picked up on as a major theme as part of who he was and his faith story. Why do you think it was so important to him to mention of Soloveitchik and Lubavitcher Rebbe time and again?
Well, I mean, it's because it's first of all, in modern day, people now want to hear people speak, not just as authorities, but they want their personal life behind it. And he was very open about that. It made it much more real. And also, it's what changed him. So when he talked to students, which he did very often, by telling his story, that he went as a student, he was actually funded by B'nai B'rith. Because I spoke at B'nai B'rith, and they told me he won an award for a writing competition, and the money he got, he used to go to America to visit. That's the whole origin of it. So that was the first award they gave him. But I think it's how because until then he was a person of the mind, of philosophy and thought. And he met these two people who, even though they were great intellectuals, they actually challenged him. What are you going to do with your life? What's your responsibility? And that changed him. The humanity of the rabbi, not the intellect, is what changed him. And I'll be very honest with you, I've got very mixed feelings about people talking about Rabbi Sachs afterwards, because they say, we know he was a great philosopher, he was a great thinker, but what I loved, the most important thing about him, and they would tell a story about his chesed. And I love that, because humanity, the greatness of a person is not just how they think, but how they act when they leave the room, the lecture hall, how they are as a human being. But so often it's done to kind of denigrate knowledge or to misunderstand knowledge. And do you understand what I've got a feeling about it?
Yeah, sure.
But for me, I think his great humanity, his thought and his way of being a caring person came together. That was a key issue for him. So I think that meant a lot for him. Also, he met the greats. I mean, if you get to meet Lubavitcher Rebbe, and you get to meet Soloveitchik, these are great stories. He then wrote about them in his writings and thoughts. So it really affected him, and he was honest. Yeah. So instead of being the kind of the sage on the stage, this perfect rabbi from above, you can't connect, he was human. He was like us. And that's why people related to him, right? He was brought up in Finchley and wasn't always so religious, and went to university and then went to yeshiva. And so people could see, I could grow, I could change what I am, I could change my path. And I think he realized that. He was always very open about it.
Yeah. Let's move along to you've got both chapters 6 and 11 we were going to talk about, just because of our timing.
Yeah, sure. There's lots of bits and pieces.
Yeah, maybe just pull it together.
Very briefly.
Okay, excellent.
I'm not going to take you chapter 6, but it's very fascinating. It's about the origins of the Renaissance and the Jewish influence on that. For me, what's interesting is it goes back to the origins of modern orthodoxy. Where does modern orthodoxy begin? Right, the idea of valuing religion and valuing general culture, putting the two together. You've got Yeshiva University, which has got both in it. But that idea, is that a modern idea? So you'll say, well, the Rambam, right? Because he read Greek philosophy, although he read it in Arabic, because he couldn't read Greek, and the Muslims had translated all into Arabic at the time. But the Rambam was an individual. For a movement, you need a group. So where does it start? And I learned this from Professor Joshua Berman, who's also a big fan of Rabbi Sachs. And Rabbi Sachs refers to this a bit in chapter 6. It's in Italy. Because Italy is the first place that Jews are allowed to go to university, in Padua. Not the main universities, right? Because they don't want, in Italy and in Spain, because the main universities, they only take Christians. You have to be a believer, right? You have to profess to the ideas of the university. But Padua was competing, so they let Jews in medicine. And that's why you have the book of the Honeycomb Flow, Moshe de Leon, and then other rabbis, and the Sforno a bit later on. This is already 15th, 16th century, writing books that are a combination of Greek thought and Judaism. That's the origins of it.
Right, yeah,
so
the likes of Zacuto.
It goes back 600 years, this approach of the university, of the two approaches. And Rabbi Sachs and LSJS, Jews College, and Yeshiva University, and myself, and you are products of this derech, of this path. It's not some modern issue. It goes way back once you trace the origins of it. And Moshe de Leon's books, and if you know them, are fascinating how he brings those things together. So in this book, Rabbi Sachs is talking about the origins of Renaissance and how those bits come together. But just very briefly, I'll do chapter 11, because chapter 11, and again, I'm not going to explain it all to you, it's brilliant, because... can I tell you when I read this, by the way? This is why it's so important. It's about Darwin, and the values of Darwin, the misunderstandings of Darwin, but why Darwinian theory is actually so useful for understanding religion, that it actually helps you. He keeps on going about the fact that you say a bracha when you see a great scientist. So I won't go too much into what he talks about, but I'll just tell you one line he says about, which is a brilliant summary of that chapter. He said, and then I'll tell you when I read this book first. He said, because what he said, the Creator, this is Rabbi Sachs' summary of Darwinian evolution. The Creator made creation creative. It's a brilliant summary. Like it's self-making. God made forms that could reproduce themselves. That's a Rosh Gadol, right? If you say God had to make every single species separately, that's a bit childish and it's a bit pathetic. Surely you should make something that, if you're a leader in an organization, you employ people who are self-motivated, who do things themselves. If you have to explain every little bit, you're not going to get anywhere. So God made a world that evolved itself. If you know the Midrashim, by the way, there's a Midrashic version of it. You know where nature responds, so the trees and the moon, all those Midrashim, it's where nature starts having a mind of its own.
Right, I mean, even in the...
So all those Midrashim are this kind of idea.
Right.
God, the Creator, God, made creation creative. It's brilliant. But just very briefly, because I know we have to discuss other things as well. So when did I write this book? When did he give me the manuscript to read? I was just going to South Africa to teach in the community there, and I'd done tours of the Natural History Museum about religion and science. And so they said, come to Johannesburg and do a tour of Maupeng. Do you know what Maupeng is? Maupeng is it's a term for the local dialect it's called the cradle of civilization. They found 2 million year old human skulls there. Some of the oldest skulls of Homo habilis, of working man, their origins. So they said, come and talk about religion and science in this place. By the way, it was a lot of Jewish, not anthropologists, what would they have been? Ancient, but paleontologists who discover these kind of things. So I'm there with 50 rabbis, and they're very nervous about what I'm saying. So I take out the galley of Rabbi Sachs' book, which is coming out, and I read from it, right? So they were like, they trust me and stuff. But I said to them, standing here, I said, when a Jew goes to Israel, it's like coming home. This is our homeland. I said, but when I stand here, this is humanity coming home. This is where human civilization began. They thought I was mad. That I could have quoted Rabbi Sachs and they felt better. But I was saying, in a way, this is a homage to the origins of human civilization. Right, you mustn't be afraid of religion and science. And I quoted from the Darwin chapter. And because Rabbi Sachs said it, so that's why it helped me, because people are nervous of this. But as soon as he had written it and explained it more clearly, it became more acceptable to talk in that way. Yeah. And to recognize that evolution doesn't clash with Judaism, it can help you deeper. I mean, my summary of Darwin is much more simple than his, which is that all life is mishpacha. That's my summary of Darwin. All life is mishpacha, it's all interrelated. Which, for me, deepens my appreciation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, rather than reducing it.
And I think he touches on that as well when he talks about, what we did find, probably post-Darwin, but from a Darwinian perspective, is the interrelatedness of all life, and that the randomness that we would have expected is not as completely random as it didn't turn out to be completely random. Everything is related, and we all are part of the one.
And the fact that it evolved in a particular way, he argues that the Darwinian view of it, as opposed to the kind of Aristotelian originally that the universe always existed, is relates much better to the Torah, which has a particular story, than anything else. It's quite radical how he does that. He turns, as he always does, everything on its head. What you think is a challenge to Judaism helps you deepen your understanding of Judaism.
Right.
And he's just fearless. And why should you be afraid? Yeah. I always think that people who resort to codes or clever proofs. I learned from Rabbi Dr. He goes, Rafi, the problem with all these people is they don't trust Torah. If you trust Torah, if you just learn Torah in a thoughtful way, it'll make sense. You don't need clever proofs.
Yeah.
You need to be eloquent, you need to be clear. But if you learn what it is and what it says, it makes sense. And therefore you can read any other subject and it'll inspire you. And so
I
I'm
think
afraid of reading anything, and I love that about him.
Yeah, no, Rabbi Sachs rereads texts in ways that we just never noticed those details. And then to show that, well, really this is the meaning, and you think, wait a sec, that really does seem much closer to the true meaning.
And that's why being defensive, you're always thinking, how is it wrong? How am I arguing? Instead of being open to think.
Yeah.
And the importance of open thinking is fundamental.
Yeah.
That's really the issue.
So it's been a busy couple of weeks at LSJS.
I don't know what you mean.
We are very blessed to have you, Rabbi Dr. Zarum, at the helm of LSJS, along with Joanne Greenaway, and of course, Chief Rabbi as the president of LSJS. And LSJS is a bastion of Torah and academic thought. It's the leading higher education institution for Jewish studies in this country, and one of the leading institutions in the world. And sometimes when one has to think about those two different approaches, that approach of Torah and the approach of science, and to see how they become a great partnership, sometimes until we reach that reconciliation, it seems like there's a clash. And let's talk about how that played itself out over the last couple of weeks. I know there's, sometimes things we read in the media aren't necessarily the way, the truth of how things worked. And we here at HGSS our hearts are warmed that resolution was found, but no doubt the resolution was there all along, and it was just something that was being worked on in its right time. And thank you for shepherding it to a happy outcome. So tell us a little about what's happened behind the scenes.
Much, Chief Rabbi, but I think this all crept up on us because of COVID. That's why things weren't so clear. I mean, it's complicated because as orthodoxy progresses and things change, people are always very nervous about those kind of developments and changes. Female ordination is a real issue in orthodoxy, right? If there's halachic arguments for these things or not, and there's a big debate in it, and it's been playing out in America for about 10 years. And it's a very challenging issue, and the Chief Rabbi felt very strongly that he wants to follow what he called mainstream orthodoxy, which is a direct result of things done by the OU in America, which I'm sure you're very aware of not recognizing female ordination. And on that principle, he wants to be very clear about that. That's not our approach of Anglo Jewry, and it's a mainstream approach. And the college LSJS is under his religious authority, and is mainstream as well. And therefore, that's his opinion, and that was important. And he wanted to assert that. But at the same time, and this is why he was actually so good about it, there was a particular story which was nothing to do with huge policy of orthodoxy, which has nothing to do with America, which is about a particular teacher in our college. We teach for many, many years, and had taken this ordination in order to further her learning. And we wanted her to continue teaching at the college. And once we got talking about it, he clarified that he doesn't believe in banning people, which I think is really commendable of his approach. We want people teaching in our synagogues and our colleges who reflect our ideology, because that's what you would do. But even within that, there's a broad range. And once we clarified that, it was very clear that he was very happy for Dr. Lindsay Taylor-Goodhart, for example, to continue teaching at the college without a title and that whole issue. But it's complicated for people, and the press kind of mucked it up because, religious ordination is not the same as a degree, right? In a degree, they don't look at your personality or what kind of person you are. They just say you passed the exam, you're qualified. But I wouldn't want rabbis of our community to people who go, I've got a degree. We'd want to know that they were decent, moral, religious people. right? I mean, technically, if you think about it, you could have a rabbi who wasn't religious but passed all the exams. Do you have to call them rabbi? No, that would be ridiculous. So obviously ordination is different from qualification. And the JC mix, when people say, oh, you have a level of learning. So there's a misunderstanding. Having said that, in our case, it wasn't about leading a community. It was about a scholar who wanted to keep studying. And the chief rabbi understood that. And when he clarified that, said, of course, carry on teaching. The sticky part was about, and he felt strongly again, and I agree with him on this issue, that a person who's taking a path different from mainstream orthodoxy shouldn't have a major role in, he saw as LSJS. But again, the position she had in academic research fellowship was a very different position. First, it's academic, and it's about research. It's not about, it's on the academic side of the college. And at this point, it became such an interesting issue because it was something that we never clarified at the college, to be honest. And that's why it kind of took us all by surprise. And we talked about it with the chief rabbi. He understood it very well, which is that, in YU and in Bar Ilan, there's a separation of the religious program, the Bet Midrash, with the academic Jewish studies. They are separate. And a very important issue in academic side is religious freedom, that you're allowed to research and say and think what you want, and anyone can do that. And all different kinds of people lecture in Bar Ilan and in Yeshiva University in the Jewish Studies departments. And so we never made that clarity in Jews College at SJS because it's a much smaller institution. Although when you look backwards, there'd always been that approach and understanding. So when we clarified that, he said, well, if it's an academic position, then he understands why that's the case.
Now, obviously, we get to the end of the story, and I think that you presented it excellently, thank you. But obviously, there's compromise all around. Is Rabbi Dr. Guthardt, Lindsay Taylor Guthardt, is she happy with the solution?
We're good friends. And when she came along, she said, look, the college has been good to me. We supported her PhD. She's very respectful of the college because we helped her at Chavrusa. And she said, look, I've done this course. I don't expect the college to recognise it because I know it's outside, but I'd like to continue teaching and I won't use the title.
Right.
And I won't be offended
right.
by not using the title because I understand that's the college. And and the chief rabbi ultimately was happy with that resolution. And
do you have any sense of how would the chief rabbi feel about Lindsay speaking here at the Shul or in United Synagogues?
Well, I think, again, he wants, ideally, and I get this, in your institution, you want people reflecting the ideas and values of your institution. But we're not like Christian universities. We're not like, so in Christian universities, you can only be a professor if you sign a creedal statement that you profess, hence professor, to the ideology, the religious ideology, right, Jesus and all that stuff, of the college, right? That is not done in Bar Ilan or Yeshiva University or LSJS, and the chief rabbi does not believe in that. You have to sign up to your ideology at the door. So in that sense, he's very sensibly, he's open to different kinds of people. But then again, he would want the main amount of people to reflect the ideology, the mainstream orthodoxy. So occasionally, I think he would say, I don't know, you have to ask him, people who are slightly to the left or to the right? But in general, he'd want people that reflect the ideology of the college.
Right.
And for me, the key issue for me is about religious freedom. Religion. Here's the problem. I talk about religious freedom. It's actually a thing. You've got religious commitment and academic freedom. And are they a clash? Religion says, Torah says you have to follow Divrei Hashem, the word of God, and halachic norms and rabbinic authority. But religious freedom, academia says, you can think what you like, right? You're free to think. Are they a clash? So I thought about this because I knew you were going to ask me about this, and I thought, how might Rabbi Sachs respond? So he'd respond with a source that would subvert the issue. So I found one. What do we say in Pirkei Avot? Right? Don't read that the letters were inscribed on the tablets, not cherut, right? Cherut, ela cherut, free. Why? And the Pirkei Avot says, Ein lecha ben chorin, ein lecha adam ben chorin, ela mi she'osek b'talmud Torah. Nobody is really free, is not a free person, unless they're involved in learning Torah. Now, Rabbi, what does that mean? That should be a contradiction. The whole point of Torah is being bound, is not being free. It's being, you're an Eved Hashem, you follow God. But he said, but the Pirkei Avot says, no, the only really free person is someone who's not just learning, but mitasek, is deeply involved with Talmud Torah. What does that Pirkei Avot mean? It's chapter 6. What does it mean, Rabbi?
I mean, Rabbi Sachs speaks to it here in this book. Even the notion of freedom being equal to religion. But freedom doesn't mean that otherworldly freedom. He says, he could have, Moses could have simply gone to the Israelites, the Hebrews in Egypt and said, okay, don't worry, there is otherworldly freedom. Everything's fine in this world. Just stay the way you are, slaves. Because this world as well needs to be a notion of freedom. So, and it wasn't until we received the Torah that we had that freedom, because freedom means freedom from the constraints of this world to something that is beyond, with the meaning, the way he describes it, the meaning being beyond the world.
Exactly. Knowledge sets you free. Right? So academic freedom doesn't mean to attack religion. Academic freedom means that actually that freedom is what will get you to deeper religious commitment. So religious commitment and academic freedom, you might think of contradictions. The Jewish approaches, they get to the same thing. So it wasn't apologetics that Yeshiva University allows the university just to get degrees. It's because the university was a great achievement of the Greeks of a serious approach to knowledge. The rabbis of the Talmud respected Greek thinkers, Chochmei Atuna, right, the wise men of Athens.
Yeah.
Why? Because they were smart. And I talk about this when we visit the Jewish Museum. When the Greek thinkers met the Jews, they were like, the Greeks thought everybody else were idiots. Right? They called them barbarians, literally, because they're barbar, they taught rubbish. And yet they met these Jews. Remember, the Torah translated into Greek in the 3rd century BCE. And they were like, these Jews have this authentic book, they have a view, they're not idiots, they're worth talking to. And you have all these conversations, I know they're much later in the Talmud described, but they're talking about conversations of Jews and Greeks. Meanwhile, the rabbis thought everybody else were idiots. Many Jews today still think everybody else are idiots, right? We have this great knowledge, and the world is, childish, as it were. The famous Disraeli line, when your ancestors were scrambling around in the fields of this country, mine were worshipping God in the Temple of Jerusalem. Right? And then the Jews met these Greeks, and they were like, wait a second, these guys have thought, they have ideas. And there was a kind of grudging understanding and respect of each other.
I mean, even just coming back to this topic that we're doing this evening of the Great Partnership, we have the famous Gemara, I think it's Moed Katan, that says, that the rabbis acknowledge, well, wait a sec, maybe we're not right on this one. Maybe they have it right in Rome.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that they engaged with that thought, they engaged with that knowledge. They weren't afraid of chokhmah yavanit, as it were. It's an important thing. And so the two things, that had to be done correctly, not against religious faith, but two to go together. So this pathway, this partnership, is very natural for Jews.
Yeah. Let's take some questions from those who have joined us here this evening, if there are questions. We'll repeat the questions so that those who are joining us online can hear. Any questions about what we've done this evening or the latest developments at LSJS? Questions, thoughts? Well, yes.
You talked about the chief rabbi, Sachs, praising or applauding uncertainty in relation to faith. How does that connect with the aspiration of emunah shlema, of perfect faith, which seems to be so perfect that it wouldn't admit of uncertainty? How does it connect with the first of the Ten Commandments, this Anochi Hashem Elokecha?
Right.
How does it connect with the psalmist who goes through the valley of the shadow of death but has no fear?
So, Clive, you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So the question is the notion of faith equaling uncertainty. How do we understand that in line with the aspiration for emunah shlema, for complete faith, for walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and yet fearing no evil because God is with me? How do we understand that? Are we uncertain, or are we completely faithful and of belief that the Almighty is guiding us?
Yeah. I mean, the question is, what's the surety that we have? Is the surety rational, logical proof, or is the surety loyalty and commitment? I mean, you translated, Clive, emunah shlema as perfect faith, but you know that's not a good translation, right? Emunah shlema is whole faith.
And I would add to that. I think that Rabbi Sachs says in a number of places, he emphasizes the notion of emunah coming from the word ne'eman, meaning trustworthy. And it's a relationship more than, we have relationships. We have a relationship with, let's say, our spouse. Does that mean that we always know with complete certainty what's going to be? No, but as long as I have that trust, that bond is tight, then I'm able to walk through that valley of shadow of death.
When do we say that psalm? I will walk through the valley of death because I'm not afraid. When does the Sach Siddur tell us we should be saying that psalm? When there's difficult times of questioning and doubt and pain and hardship, which are real. And so we assert that psalm to remind ourselves not to be afraid. We say it when we're afraid. We say it to not be afraid. It's a process. We're not computers that switch on. I believe, I don't believe. We're complicated people moving the whole time. And faith helps us go through the valley. And by stating it, it helps us go through that path. That's the whole point of it.
And he speaks about it here in this book as well, the notion of what I guess colloquially we would refer to as tzaddik be'emunasa yichya, that the righteous lives by his faith, that if given the choice to face the storm, knowing that I'm being carried through it, versus thinking that it's random, what would I rather?
Yeah, that's true. And I'm interested. We could go into the whole book, The Life of Pi, which is a great book about that whole issue. But interesting, because I'm actually writing about it at the moment. But the loyalty is often not just to God, but to people as well. What do we say when they cross the sea when they're really afraid? Right, and then God splits the sea. Vayaminu b'Hashem with Moshe Avdo. They believed in God and Moses' servant. Now, if belief, vayaminu b'Hashem, if Ya'amin is to belief in an abstract, non-physical God, how can you then say Uv Moshe Avdo and Moses' servant afterwards? Moses is a human, physical being. So it's not about some kind of, it's about trust. It's about they bought into God and they were on the side of, they were loyal to Moses and God. Every time we say Amen, right, we're agreeing to something.
Yeah.
It's a kind of commitment issue as opposed to for me, the way I'm writing about it, it's more, emunah is about affiliation, not affirmation. It's a very different thing.
So move on to uncertainty from that.
Right?
What you've done so far is you've spoken about the absence of certainty, but uncertainty is something stronger than that.
Right, because you can't be certain of physical issues because your life is changing the whole time. So he writes about it later on, and then faith helps you get towards that. So because life is uncertain, faith is the ability to live with that, to go through the process. You have to live a life. Right? That's the point.
We'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up for the evening.
And he does, like this, I'm simplifying it. In the book, he does address that issue. He begins with it and then he gets deeper onto those issues. And the last chapter is why belief in God. And he really believes, I think he's trying to respond to that. So it ends up being more philosophical than scientific. But
I was going to say shalom, also I think of it in terms of shalom, that when you have difficulties, when you come to shalom, when you come to a peaceful conclusion and acceptance, then the uncertainty isn't as troubling for you.
But again, he's not just doing it for pragmatic. I know you didn't mean that, but sometimes people get Jews just say, it's better to believe because you'll feel better about it. He thinks there's more to it than that.
Right.
He really thinks, and this issue you mentioned earlier about the only way of understanding a system is something outside the system is fundamental. So he pushes you. But we can't explain it in an hour. You have to read the book and let him try and reach to the language he's trying to reach. Because no matter how much I try and say, you can't prove God because God's not about proof. You're still thinking in that way. You have to let go of that way of thinking about things. And that takes time. Think of anything that you've let go of the way of thinking about that reality in a different kind of way. That takes time to let go of that. And when you do that and you start thinking in a different kind of way, then you can begin to see the nature of God. The problem is, we daven as kids from day one. We're davening, talking to God. And then we don't really understand what we're doing. And we sometimes have to go away to come back to understand. That's also the Sax's trip, which is fundamental. You have to go away to understand what it really means. And I've done that for myself. I've come back to my davening of what do I mean when I say this?
Well, let me just use that to segue into a conclusion and thank you not only Rabbi Dr. Zarum for this evening's wonderful exchange and learning the Torah Sheba'al Peh from Rabbi Sachs's Torah Shebechsav of the Great Partnership, but this time last year you put out a wonderful piece on prayer in advance of the high holidays. We're looking forward to using it again this year. Thank you for teaching us how to daven and developing our relationship with the Almighty. Thank you for everything you do for Anglo Jewry, and thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to having you for a Shabbat sometime soon.
It's my pleasure. And I'll just end with Rabbi Sachs' quote, his summary of his whole book, where he says, "Science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean." Now, it is pithy and it's a one-liner, but you read the whole book and you get what he means.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
I look forward to coming again.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.